Good morning and welcome to Quilting with Lori. My name is Lori Dickman and today we are on part 2 of my beginning quilting class. I'm so happy that many of you have joined me in this class. Many folks are trying to learn to quilt and I wanted to provide access to an entire series where you can learn from the very basics to the more complicated blocks. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm going to take you step by step through how to quilt from the very simple blocks like we did last week to another simple block today, and then we'll have more blocks that I'll be showing you, and they'll progressively get a little bit more complicated, but that's good. You'll learn lots of different techniques. There is a PDF that I have attached to the description box, and you'll see this is the sample quilt that we'll be putting together with the sample blocks, and there's a variety of techniques in that. But I did want to point out the quilt behind me is a sampler quilt just similar to this one. I actually made this one about 20 years ago. I did this for a beginning quilting class that I taught, and it was a real fun one, and we're going to be doing pretty much the same thing this time. I did want to point out the background colors that I chose there. I used a teal, brown, and beige for this quilt, and you'll notice in the PDF and in the quilt that I'm preparing today, the background is sort of a light blue. You can use whatever fabrics that you want to use, and I do indicate that in the PDF. You don't necessarily have to go with light backgrounds or medium backgrounds. Maybe you'd like to do a black backgrounds or navy blue backgrounds. The scrappier the better, really. So if you have a lot of scraps in your stash, this will be a great opportunity for you to use those up to make each and every one of these blocks. And then the sashing and the borders can actually unify the whole thing. It will be a lot of fun. Let's see how we're going to make block 2 today. So here's the fabrics that I'm going to be using for today's block. And this is what I prepared for last week's block. This was the rail fence that we made last week, a real fun and simple one. In fact, if you choose to make a block, or a quilt, excuse me, from this block only, that would make a gorgeous quilt. It would go together very quickly, and it would be a lot of fun. It's a wonderful way to get started on making an entire quilt. So that was last week's block. This week's block is the square in a square variation, and the PDF attached in the description box below will give you the instructions. And then of course I'll be walking through those today. You're also going to notice that there is a PDF attached for the triangle and the logs that are going to be in the middle of that block. I think you can see it better if I show you the color version. So there are triangles that go around the outside edge, and then these 3 logs or rectangles that are in the center. You can certainly use the PDFs, trace them, and then trace them onto the back of your fabric, and then cut out the fabric pieces that you would need. You would need 1 each of these in 3 different fabrics, and then you would need 4 of these triangles in whatever background fabric you're using. I'm using this sort of a beige-ish background fabric, so my triangles will be cut from that. But what I'm going to share with you today is how you don't actually have to use these PDFs for this block. You can literally just rotary cut some strips, and then we'll subcut the logs or these rectangles, and then we're going to rotary cut a strip, a 5-inch strip for this block. I think it's a 5 or a 5.5. I believe it's 5.5-inch strip for these triangles, and then we're going to subcut it, and then we're going to cut each of them on the diagonal. So a really simple way to accomplish this without having to use templates. We're simply going to use our rotary cutter, our rotary mat, and ruler. So let me show you how we're going to do that. Another thing I wanted to point out is I would recommend getting a notebook together for all of the PDFs. And I've taken a copy of that first page of our sampler, the introduction of this class, and I put it in the front of this notebook. And then every PDF that I've got for this particular class will go in a sleeve, and that way you've got each of your instructional sheets here for future use, plus you can put your PDFs in those plastic sleeves as well. And this will just really keep your class information all handy in a notebook. Now let's take a look at these 3 fabrics that I'm going to use to cut out my square in a square variation block. The first thing I'm going to do is get my background triangles cut. And here's what I'm going to do. I am going to cut strips that are one strip actually is all I'm going to need. I've got a fat quarter here of this beige fabric. I made sure that it's squared up, so it's squared up here. Let me make sure it's lined up on this line for you. I make sure it's centered in the screen for you. All right, so it is ready to be cut, and I'm going to cut a 5.5-inch strip. Now, I do have that information in the PDF, so you'll have that available as well if you choose to use this rotary cutting method. And my ruler, let's see, my ruler is a 6-inch ruler, and so what I'm going to do is bring it over 5.5 inches. So this 1/2 inch here is hanging off the edge because I'm not going to be using that. I only need a 5.5-inch strip, which is what's under the ruler right here. I'm making sure that it's even here, that is even all the way down that 5.5-inch line, that it's even here, and now I'm going to make a cut. There we go. All right, so now I have a strip, and I did this on the fold. So I have a strip of this beige fabric, and it's a 5.5-inch wide strip. The next thing I'm going to do, I think I'm going to square up this bottom edge a little bit. It looks a little funky here, so I'm going to bring this over, making sure I have everything lined up. I keep double checking to make sure that I'm in the screen for you. There, we got rid of that. Okay, so now I'm going to subcut this into 2 5.5-inch squares. And so I'm making sure this is lined up here, this is lined up on the 5.5, that's lined up there in the 5.5, and we'll cut. So this is left, oops, this is left over for a future square. Now I have 2, they're on the fold, so I have 2 of these squares, and what I'm simply going to do is cut this on the diagonal from corner to corner with my ruler. And I now have the triangles that I need to make my square and a square block. So the beige is done. Now we're going to go to the 3 rectangles that I need to cut. Now we're going to cut the logs, and I need 3 logs and 1 in each color, or you could have them all the same color. It's totally up to you, but I'm going to have mine in the 3 different colors as it shows on this photo right here. So that's what I plan to do. And the colors that I've chosen are this pink here, this medium pink, and then my dark pink. Those are the 3 shades that I'm going to use for this purpose. You could use your template if you wanted to cut this out on the dotted line. If you use a template, you've got to use the dotted line when you're cutting, because you need that 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around each of these rectangles and triangles. There is a dotted line, and that is your seam allowance. It's important that you have that. And if you measure from here to there, it's 2 5/8 of an inch. So I'm simply going to cut strips that are 2 5/8 inches wide. And that's what I've done with this one already. And the 2 5/8 inch, you'll have to identify where that is on your ruler, but there are little notches in there, 1/8 notches. And 2.5 inches is 2 4/8, and then 5/8 would be the very next notch. So make sure to identify that properly on whatever ruler you're using, and lay this over here. Let me move this stuff out of the way. So there's 2 1/2, that's the 1/2 inch line, but I want to go to 2 5/8, so it's just 1 more 1/8. Let me straighten this up a little bit so it's right on that line too. All right, so I have it at 2 5/8 here. It's on that 2 5/8 line all the way down, straight here, straight across there. Now I can make my cut. So there's the second one. And now I'll go to the 3rd fabric, and that one is this dark one. Again, I'll make sure I'm in the screen here for you so you can see what I'm doing. All right, so now there is 2 1/2, but I need 2 5/8. 2 1/2 is actually 2 4/8, so we need to move it over one more 1/8 of an inch. So there's the 2 5/8 inch mark on my ruler. It's level here, level up there. Now I can make my cut. I didn't get all the way through down here. Whoops, I'm having some issues. I don't know what my problem is here. Guess I need to stand up. I wasn't pressing hard enough. All right, so we have all 3 of our strips. They're the width of the fabric, and they're 2 5/8 inches wide. And what I'm going to do now is subcut those. I need 1 of each of these in as a rectangle, and the length that I need to cut, let me grab my sheet again, the length is 6 5/8 inches. So I'm stacking all 3 of them here. I have all 3 of my units stacked, and you can kind of see I have them all right there. I am going to square up the end here, which will remove any selvage. We don't want any selvage in our blocks at all, and I'm going to flip it up here and just make sure there's no selvage. Okay, now what I need to identify is 6 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to have to make my ruler go sideways here. So again, 6 1/2 is at that mark, and 6 5/8 is the next mark over. So identify where that is on your ruler, the ruler that you're using. There's my 1/2 inch mark, and there's my 5/8, and I need to go 6 5/8, and I can make my cut. And there we go. So I now have the 3 fabrics that I plan to use for the inside of this block. These are extra pieces that I will hold on to because I can probably use them as I cut additional pieces for the rest of my block. So I will add them to my stack of fabrics. I'm keeping all of my fabrics in a basket. That way I have them accessible every time I do a block. The first thing we're going to want to do is to put together the center of the block, and that's the square in a square. So those 3 rectangles right there, I'm going to sew together. And I've decided to put my lighter one in the middle. You can lay them out any way you choose, but that's how I have decided to lay mine out. So what I'm going to do is simply place this over here. I'm going to bring it to the sewing machine and sew a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Let me see if I can get this so you can see what I'm doing here. And it always helps to use a scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and by that I mean a thread or 2 less than a 1/4 of an inch. That will just help with the turn of fabric, and it won't eat into your seam allowance so much. So there's one. I'm going to press to the dark. So I've just simply finger pressed to the dark. So that one is ready there, and once I'm done with this center block, I'll take it to the iron and actually press it with the iron. But for now, I've finger pressed it toward the dark. Now I'm going to add the 3rd piece, and I'm going to put it right here. So I will put it right sides together, matching up the seam allowances. These are perfectly even. I'm going to sew a 1/4 of an inch, a scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance across the top of that. And what I'm going to do again is finger press to the darker side. And I have this unit ready. I'm going to go press it at the ironing station, and I'll be right back. My center unit is pressed and ready to go. The seam allowances have been pressed toward the dark, and that's ready to go. Now what I have done is I've taken each of these triangles and I have pressed a crease in the center of them. So I flipped it either right side or wrong side, but just press a crease so you know where the exact center is of each of these long edges on the triangles. I also pressed a corresponding crease in the center of both the vertical and horizontal edges of my square in a square. So these creases are going to match up. What I'm going to do is flip that crease to match up with the crease underneath, flip this one to match up with the crease underneath, and you'll notice these points fall off the edge, and that's good. You want the points to fall off the edge. Let me grab a couple of pins here. So what I'm going to do, you can pin, I typically don't pin, but if you're a beginner quilter, you definitely want to pin to ensure that everything stays where it belongs. So you could pin perpendicular on 3 sections here of this triangle so that it stays nicely where it belongs till you get it up to the machine. You can also pin the other side. I do opposite sides at once, and then once this is done, we'll come back and do the other side. So this crease matches the crease underneath, and I've pinned it. And we'll pin this, and we'll pin here. All right, now I'm going to take it to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 of an inch, a scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance here. I'm going to sew a scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance here, and I'll bring it back to the tabletop. And make sure as you're sewing to remove the pins before you get to them. You never want to keep a pin in the seam allowance as you don't want to sew over a pin. It is more than likely going to break, and this could land in your eye and could give some serious damage. So be sure to remove pins before you stitch them. I've sewn the block. So I've sewn the 1/4 inch over here and over here, a scant 1/4 inch. I've opened it. I've finger pressed it away from the center block. Actually, it worked better. You might, if your outside fabrics are very light and if your seam allowances show through, you might want to press it toward the seam allowance. The reason I didn't is because there's a lot of fabric on each of these points, and it just seems to lay better this way. Plus, it's not showing through on my outside fabric here, so I'm good to go. Now we're going to finish with these last 2 pieces here, and again I've got creases here, creases there, and I'm going to simply match up those creases and pin just like I did before, and you'll see that match up the crease. They do extend off the edge, and that's good. And I guess I need to grab my pins again. I left them over at the machine. So here we have this one. I'm just making sure I've got it on the crease. By matching the creases, you're ensuring that that triangle is on the square properly, that it's not cattywampus. So make sure that you crease those triangles, crease the square, and match those creases up. Okay, so now again, I'm going to start on the very edge and sew all the way down this side. And those little valleys right there basically indicate where my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance is, and I'll be stitching on that. So I'm going to go do that, removing the pins as I get to them, and I'll bring it back to the tabletop. This is a great little block, so I've just finished it. I have pressed it, and for my block, I've pressed all of these seam allowances toward the triangles, only because it laid fine. They're not showing through. I don't see the seam allowance underneath showing through because this fabric, although it's a lighter fabric, it's dark enough that you're not seeing the seam allowances. So that worked out well for me. Everything lays nice and flat. You can see all my little dog ears here, but we're going to trim this block up to 9.5 inches, and that will eliminate all that excess fuzz and dog ears here. Now, what's really important whenever you're trimming up a block is that you maintain a 1/4 of an inch above each and every triangle, because that's the seam allowance for each of those sides of the block. You need that 1/4 of an inch, or you'll end up cutting off your beautiful points. You don't want to lose your points when you put this block in with its sashing or with another block. So I do have a 9.5-inch OmniGrid ruler, which is a great way to square this block up. But you don't have to have one of these. If you just simply have a regular ruler, you can use your mat to line this up and get it squared up. But make sure when you square it up that you're giving yourself that 1/4 of an inch on each side. This one is definitely a 1/4. These are larger. So when I line this up, I'm going to make sure that this 1/4 of an inch stays here, making sure all of that lines up well on each side there. Okay, looking good. So I'm going to go ahead and I should have this on my rotating mat for you so that I could just rotate it, but I don't. So I'll flip the block. These two sides have been trimmed. Now I'm going to do the other two sides here. So again, this one was done and this one was done. Now I need to trim up the other two sides. Whoops. And there we go. So there is our block. It's all ready to go. It's pressed and ready to add to my basket of blocks that I've put together. So that's your square and a square variation. This was last week's rail fence. Great blocks, wonderful blocks to learn different techniques. You've started with simple rectangles. Here we've added some triangles to the rectangles. And next week, let's see, what is next week's block? Let me grab my introductory sheet. All right, I found my introductory sheet. And next week's block, our next series block, is going to be the monkey wrench block. It's the double monkey wrench block. That one is going to be fun. So again, we're going to be working with some triangles. And this time we're going to learn to create half square triangles. That's going to be on the outer 4 sides. We'll have a square and we'll have some rectangles in that block. Again, a simple block, but we're progressively learning more and more techniques on how to put different types of quilt blocks together. I'm so glad you've joined me today for block number 2, which is the square and a square variation. Hopefully you've completed last week's block. Actually, I guess these are coming out every couple of weeks. I keep saying next week and last week, but they are every couple of weeks when you see the next block. And in a few weeks, we're going to be doing the monkey wrench block, so I'm looking forward to that. Don't forget to put your PDF pages in a nice notebook so that you'll have everything handy. Gather all your fabrics that you're using for this quilt, this sample quilt, and have them in a basket or in a box of some sort so that they're easily accessible to you each time we do a new block. I'm so thankful that you've joined me. I'm really enjoying it, and hopefully you'll let me know in the comments what fabrics you're using, what colors, what backgrounds you're using. I'd love to hear from each of you. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. That really does help my channel to get out to other viewers just like yourself. Thank you so much. We will see you soon, and happy quilting.